Folks, welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad you're here on a Saturday night here in my lovely Brooklyn apartment. So much to discuss. What an evening, what a world we are living in at this time. Let me make sure we don't have an echo there. Glad you're joining us. Glad you are here. Please take this opportunity to tweet this out. Get other people to make this a bigger conversation. We want as many people to be here and join us in this lovely conversation about what's going on in the world, politics, geopolitics, economy, ideology, and so much more. Shout out to Ronnie Miller. Good to see you. Shout out to other folks who are joining us. Don't forget to tweet this out. So much that we can discuss. So much going on in the world. It's been a while since I've been on here last, about 2 weeks, but in that time, I actually had the opportunity to give a presentation. Is America the New Rome? And that talk is on YouTube, and I must say it's doing very, very well. Right? I just put it up Wednesday, and already well over 1,000 views. This is big, and I want to thank everyone who made a point of attending that presentation in New York City. I really had a good time giving it. It was a really nice event, very intimate, good group of folks that were there. And we just had a great time. And the presentation I gave, Is America the New Rome, is getting a lot of circulation. You know, a lot of people really felt like I spoke to them, like there was something I was really getting at. Wow, shout out to Trace Kims, shout out to Sharon Pitts, shout out to MJ, right? Glad you folks are joining us, right? We love you all. We are a community here. I talk about how among us there are fans, good to meet fans. There are haters, good to meet you haters. If you are hate watching this because you totally disagree with me, that's fine. Welcome, welcome. Glad to see you here. And furthermore, shout out to the lurkers, those who are watching this who don't really have a viewpoint. We're just kind of undecided, want to hear what I have to say, but don't really want to chime in. You are just as welcome. You are just as much an acknowledged part of this community as anybody else. Just making sure I have my water. So thank you for joining us. So much that we can discuss here. I wanted to begin by giving a shout out to, somebody who passed away yesterday. Somebody who I knew rather intimately when I was an activist in New York City. It was an individual named John Denny, who lived in Staten Island. And John Denny, he was a great activist. I first met him years ago, probably 2011, maybe 2012, when he was leading protests around the issue of cuts in postal services, right? He supported, he was a retired postal worker, and he supported the postal workers' unions, opposed cuts in postal services, cuts in postal jobs. And he was just all over those protests. He was very active, just full of energy. An Irish guy from Staten Island, John Denny. And after he started coming to those postal rallies and being involved in the rallies around the post office, he was at every rally around every cause ever. And, he was retired, and he wore his postal worker outfit, his postal worker uniform. He was out there demonstrating and protesting, and he was just an amazing man. I remember when Pamela Geller is this billionaire here in New York City who really, really hates Arabs and Muslims. She's a big supporter of Israel. She put ads in the subways in New York City that's saying that Palestinians were savages, right? And in Israel, and a support between civilized man and savages support the civilized man, saying that Palestinians were savages. So she put those ads in the subway. And I remember John Denny and a bunch of us that were activists went to the MTA board hearing to protest against those racist ads. And John Denny, with his white beard, his postal worker outfit, he got up there and he held up a sign and he shouted at the MTA board. He said, "Take these ads down! Take these ads down!" And we were in the audience there, and we were thinking, whoa, that's a little bit much. But then it was all over the local news here in New York. John Denny, retired postal worker, shouting at Pamela Geller and those who would call Muslims and Arabs savages, "Take these ads down! Take them down!" It was just a poetic moment. I mean, it was really beautiful. And I must say, any rally. I remember when I was working out of the UN, I was reporting from the UN. I would run into John Denny all the time Not intentionally, because there's a couple FedExes near the UN, and he and those retired postal workers who were against cuts in postal services were urging people to boycott FedEx because FedEx was lobbying to get the postal services and the post office privatized. And I remember I'd see John and 5 or 6 other postal workers protesting outside of FedEx. I'd always go and shake their hands. It was really nice. And John, I mean, he had his own YouTube channel. He put a couple of my talks up on the YouTube channel. He liked them, and I mean, any rally, he was there. He was very vocal, very full of energy. He would talk about how he first got politically active because he was Roman Catholic, and he attended church every Sunday, and he opposed the U.S. involvement in Nicaragua, where the U.S. government was funding these Contras who were killing priests and nuns. And John Denny, he started back in the 80s going to rallies and protests against U.S. military involvement and funding of the terrorist forces to try and bring down the Sandinistas of Nicaragua. That was John Denny, and I'll remember, it's interesting because in my life, he meant a lot to me. I know he meant a lot to the activist community. I mean, he was out there, he's from Staten Island, he was at every rally for Eric Garner against police brutality. The Garner family knew him. John Denny was a good guy, and he was around every cause, Palestine, anti-police brutality, labor unions. He was out at every rally, but in particular, he meant a lot to me because folks will know I'm no longer an activist. I'm a journalist, a political analyst. I give my views, I give talks, but I'm not going to rallies, I'm not going to marches, I'm not politically active, I'm not campaigning for folks. I'm a journalist at this point. I'm not a political organizer or activist. I'm not affiliated with any particular party. I don't play that role anymore. I think this is more the role that I play, is giving commentary and analysis like this and staying out of the political process. But as I transitioned in toward this role and started working at different media outlets, and around the time of the 2016 presidential election, my name was mud among leftists. I mean, I must have been called every nasty word in the whole Marxist vocabulary, right? People were calling me, oh boy, I mean, I was just, the rumors were flying around, and I was public enemy number one because I didn't, and I still don't, go along with the Russiagate and the hate Donald Trump and join with CNN and Rachel Maddow to drive out Donald Trump because Donald Trump isn't, saying naughty words and might not be enthusiastic enough about starting World War III. My name was mud, right? I was just every left-wing rally, every communist, socialist, all the mainline irrelevant communist groups, they just, they had it out for me because of the role that I was playing and some of what I was writing and all of that. But not John. John was a good guy. He didn't necessarily agree with me on everything, but, he knew I was a good guy. He respected me, and we kept talking, and we kept being friends. And when I actually broke one of the biggest rules on the left, which is one of the stupidest rules, and I had a public debate, with a white supremacist named Augustus Sol Invictus. I had a public debate with a far-rightist, right, with a fascist, I guess. I had a public debate with Augustus Sol Invictus. John Denny was in the audience, right? If you watch the film, John Denny is there, and he attended that debate, and he had my back at a quite a stressful situation where I was debating one of the most well-known far-rightists in the United States, someone who's actually was heavily involved in the Charlottesville incident. If you watch the film of that debate, John Denny was there, and he was in the audience. He was there supporting me and supporting my right to publicly refute far right-wing ideas and engage in civil dialogue and not have everything escalate to some kind of armed confrontation that the left is guaranteed to lose because the right has all the guns. I publicly debated Augustus Sol Invictus. There was John Denny. I'll tell you, there was a time where people were, my name was mud, people that I thought were my friends, people I'd slept over at their houses, people that I was just intimate with, just didn't want anything to do with me because of, where I was working and what I was doing and how I was arguing about the presidential election. My name was mud. But John was a real friend, right? And there's not enough people like John, people that know right and wrong and are not just going to cave in and go along with the crowd, people who don't jump on the bandwagon, people that stand by people even if they don't necessarily agree with them, because John certainly didn't agree with everything I was saying, but, he was a good guy. And just seeing that he's left us, he ran for office on the Green Party ticket out in Staten Island a few times in his final years, and he was a good guy, a good man. Right? A retired postal worker. a Roman Catholic, a Bible-believing Roman Catholic, and a communist. I will say he was definitely a communist. There's pictures across the internet of him marching with hammers and sickles. He was definitely a Marxist and a communist. Very proud of his socialist and communist beliefs. He had studied Stalin. He had studied the writings of Dr. Grover Furr. He was a big fan of Dr. Grover Furr, who teaches at Montclair State University and is a critic of the prevailing view of Stalin. And John Denny was a good guy. John Denny was a great guy, and he, I'm still reacting to the loss of John Denny because, there are so few good people out there like John Denny. I must say that. He was a great guy, and I mean, to see him there, I'll never forget that moment, seeing him at that MTA board meeting with Pamela Geller there shouting, "Take these ads down! Take them down!" I remember at one point, there was a rally that we had, like a march against capitalism. I think this was like 2013, maybe even further back. And I remember, this guy was a Bible-believing Catholic. He was a loyal Catholic, but we marched past the big cathedral in New York, and he got on the bullhorn, and he called out the bishops in the Catholic Church here in New York who live in absolute splendor and said, why aren't they spending money to feed the poor and take care of people? Why are they living in splendor off the tithes and the offerings and donations of working people, of hardworking people? I mean, he called out the clergy of his own church. So John Denny was a great guy, and he will be missed, if ever. So, it's a loss, and, John Denny was a great human being, and I was really honored to know him. I know he was a father. I know he was a postal worker. He had a whole different life other than his activism and his advocacy of socialism and Marxism. But in addition to that, he was a good guy, and I knew him as a communist, as a hardworking guy, and as a loyal friend, somebody who didn't cave into peer pressure and betray me when it became trendy among leftists to bash me. So I have absolute love and respect for John Denny. I always will. I will never forget John Denny, to hear that he was lost. So, good friend of mine. But thank you all for listening to me talk about a dear friend of mine who I lost. I might be of interest to people. People are curious. People always wonder what kind of person becomes a communist in the United States. Well, John Denny is one of those people. But anyway, what else is on people's minds? I've got a number of things we can talk about here tonight. So much going on in the world. Did you folks see that State of the Union address? Oh boy. Oh boy. Now, I know you all probably want to hear what I have to say about the socialism comments, and I'll get to that. But I think that Donald Trump may very well have had his basket of deplorables moment. Right? He very poorly overshot himself when he said that the United States is having a, quote, economic miracle. Economic miracle. Those are the words that he used. An economic miracle in the United States of America. That should shock everyone. An economic miracle, right? When we've got record amounts of household debt. Household debt in the United States has never been anywhere near as high as it is at this moment. We've got record amounts of student debt, something that doesn't exist in most developing countries, where people have to borrow money in order to get by, in order to go get an education, and they become debt to banks, and it's one type of loan they can never be bankrupt on, right? So student debt is at an all-time high. Personal and household debt is at an all-time high. Infrastructure is crumbling. There are municipalities across the country that are unpaving the roads because they cannot afford to maintain them. They don't have enough tax revenue to maintain paved roads. Don't even think about high-speed railway or anything like that. Paved roads are being gotten rid of in places like Vermont and places like Alabama and places like Mississippi. But Donald Trump thinks this is an economic miracle, right? It's beyond me, right? And he's right that unemployment is low. There has been a slight, and I will say slight, let me hear you say slight uptick in wages. Wages are still far lower for the next generation of workers. We've got an economy of low-wage jobs, of short-term jobs, but there has been a slight uptick in terms of wages. But for him to say economic miracle, right? The United States is in the middle of an economic miracle where there are lines outside of food banks, right? The Department of Agriculture talks about the rate of food insecurity and the number of children in the United States who live in a state of food insecurity, and households that are food insecure. But Donald Trump thinks that this is an economic miracle, right? And let me add that there's been a lot of voices, not far left Marxist voices, but there's been a lot of voices within the mainstream, like The Economist magazine, like the Wall Street Journal, like, the Financial Times, like Business Weekly, that have been predicting a downturn, right? First there was a bit of a surge on Wall Street after Trump got in, but then things got a little shaky the past few months after Donald Trump did his whole tariff thing against China. And the Wall Street, we've seen some big crashes, we've seen some big plunges, things going down very dramatically, days, and then it'll recover. We've seen some big moments in the last few weeks, in the last few months, but Donald Trump thinks this is an economic miracle. And I think this could be Donald Trump's basket of deplorables moment, right? Because every time there is some bad economic news, all they have to do is roll the tape, right? Economic miracle, right? There's mass layoffs. People are losing their jobs. They roll the tape. Oh, Donald Trump says it's an economic miracle, right? If there's home foreclosures, right? Oh, Donald Trump, he says it's an economic miracle, right? I mean, these words, I think, if there is any honesty in the part of the media, these words about an economic miracle, where Donald Trump insists there's an economic miracle going on, when conditions in the United States haven't really improved that much, and we're still in a low-wage economy with crumbling infrastructure, with record levels of debt, I would say that Donald Trump is going to have to eat those words, right? I'm not part of the liberal anti-Trump thing. I think there are some good things that Donald Trump has done, and I will get to that later as well. But those words about economic miracle, yeah, he overshot it. It's very similar to when Hillary Clinton said that half of Trump's supporters were a basket of deplorables, right? If she had just said there's a lot of bad people who support Trump, it would have been fine. But she said half of Trump's supporters are a basket of deplorables, and that destroyed Hillary Clinton. Well, Donald Trump, he could have just said, hey, the economy's doing better. He could have done that. That's kind of standard for a president. Even when the economy's crashing, they get up and have to say it's good. It's almost their job to motivate investment in the country, right? But he said it's an economic miracle. Right? He way overshot himself. And I feel like those words are going to come back to haunt him. They are going to come back to haunt him. But what else is on people's minds tonight? Now, as far as the State of the Union is concerned, now I wanted to get to the socialism stuff, and you've seen my comments on that. I feel really good about what Donald Trump did. Because my whole life, people have said to me, socialism in the United States, it'll never happen, right? Everybody knows how evil communism is, Caleb. Everyone knows how evil socialism is. We love capitalism. If you believe in socialism or Marxism, then you're somebody, if you're somebody who believes in that, you're on the fringes of U.S. society. No one's going to listen to you. Everyone thinks you're a nut job and a loony, and nobody has any room for that, and you're just going to be relegated to the extremist. Well, I'll tell you, the fact that Donald Trump, in his State of the Union address, had to take his anti-communist and anti-socialist rant up to the next level and start addressing people who want socialism in the United States of America, right? That's a level of methinks the lady doth protest too much, right? No president throughout the entire Cold War, right? The entire time that communism was the main enemy of the United States of America, right? From Truman all the way up to now, no president has ever gotten up and said the USA will never be a socialist country. They never had to say it. It was just kind of assumed, right? It was just assumed. But now, right, socialism has become so popular in the United States and among the U.S. public, and there is so much widespread debate about socialist and Marxist principles that the president of the country, in his State of the Union address, not a passing comment, his State of the Union address, had to get up on national television in front of Congress and assure everybody that America will never be a socialist country. That is big, right? That's big. You and me, those of us who watch this debate, we are much closer to the mainstream. The people watching this live, the way we see things are far, far closer to the mainstream than ever before in my lifetime, right? Working people in the United States have had it up to here, right? They're tired of low wages. They're tired of the country meddling and bombing and destroying other countries while they let this country lie in shambles. They're tired of big corporations ripping off the public, and they are open to hearing about socialism and communism and Marxism more than ever before in my lifetime. Right? This is big. This is very, very, very big, right? And this is a great moment for those of us who believe in socialism and Marxism and communism to be alive. I'll tell you that much. It is a great moment for us because they show that we are on the radar screens of the most powerful people. They are shaking in their shoes. And let me add that I don't think Trump's rant was about Ocasio-Cortez. I don't think Donald Trump's rant was about Bernie Sanders. I think Donald Trump's rant was about people like you and us. It was about Bolivarianism in Venezuela. It was about the rise of China and the socialist planned economy of China that is booming and building infrastructure and development all over the world. Socialism, a system where the banks, factories, and industries are operated for public good and not for profits, right? Planned economies are booming all over the world. And there are a lot of people in the United States who think, why do we just let the rich and powerful do whatever they want? Why don't we have a government that works for the working people? Why don't we have a government of action that fights for working families, right? That understanding is bigger than it's ever been in my lifetime. People in the United States want things to change. They are tired of the fact that our government is bought and sold by billionaire banker corporations that aren't even loyal to the country. They're loyal to Wall Street monopolism. They have no problem gutting this country economically while they gut and destroy countries in the developing world. People are tired of it. They're tired of seeing their country turn into a low-wage police state. And they are looking for an alternative. And Donald Trump really fears that socialist ideas, be they Marxist socialism, be they Bolivarian socialism, be they Ba'athist Arab socialism, be they Christian socialism, they fear that those kind of ideas are going to become more popular. But don't get me wrong, I'm not part of this anti-Trump crowd. I'm not part of the drive out Trump because he won't attack Russia and start World War III movement. I am not part of that movement. And that brings me to what I thought was good, the part of Donald Trump's speech that was good, that I agreed with. Donald Trump's prison reform policies were very, very good, and he announced them, and it was very, very good, and I was so glad to see it. And in a way, Donald Trump did what no Democrat would ever be permitted to do, right? Donald Trump said that the federal sentencing, right, in federal courts, the federal prison sentences are far, far too high. It is insane, the amount of people we have in federal prison, the sentences that people get that locked away in these federal prisons. It is too much, right? We have been locking up people at a federal level and a local level at a crazy rate that is unnecessary. It's not good for the country. It's not good for anybody, right? Now, it might be good for the weapons manufacturing corporations who get the free labor of those federal prisoners, right? That's been revealed. Might be good for the corporations that get to pay, charge these prisoners $5 a minute for their phone calls to their families or something. But this policy of mass incarceration from the federal level down to the state level, it's a bad policy. It's been bad for the country. Donald Trump has taken some dramatic reforms to try and scale back some of this mass incarceration, right? Because it's bad for the country. Good for him, right? And no Democrat would have gotten away with what Trump did. Now, we know Obama let a lot of nonviolent drug offenders out of federal prison. He pardoned a lot of people. But, record here, right? What Donald Trump did by bringing an African-American woman to the State of the Union who he had pardoned, who had been convicted of drugs, who he had pardoned, bringing her to the State of the Union. Imagine if Obama had done that. Can you imagine the response if Obama had done that, right? It would have been, oh my God, Obama brought this black criminal to the State of the Union. Oh my God, this is dangerous. I mean, how do we know she wouldn't have killed the people standing? Oh my God, it would have been the most crazy, racist, over the top, they would have been using that thug word. They would have been crazy. If Obama had brought a black woman who'd been convicted of drug crimes, who he had pardoned, to the State of the Union, they would have gone crazy. But does that mean Trump shouldn't have done it? No, it means Trump should have done it because he could do it. Obama couldn't do it. So good for Trump for doing that. I give Trump an A+ on that federal prison reform. I wish he had done more. I think it needs to be more. There's still far too many people locked up. And this points to the fact that when there are divisions in the ruling class, this creates an opening for the people, right? Good friend of mine, shout out to George if you're watching. George and I were talking today. We had a little chat this afternoon, and he was talking about the federal prison reform and how blown away he was by these moves that Trump took. And he said to me, it's interesting. Have you ever noticed that every rich person who's gone to prison seems to be a Trump supporter? Think about it, right? Every rich person who gets dragged away for white-collar crime, financial fraud or tax fraud, go down the line, almost all of them are Trump supporters, right? And why is that? Because the richest of the rich, you don't think that they don't engage in tax fraud? You don't think that they don't engage in Ponzi schemes and white-collar crimes and ripping people off? Oh, they sure do. But they're well tied in with the establishment enough that they don't go to jail for it, right? If you're a millionaire who goes to jail, which does happen in the United States, right? You're a millionaire who goes to jail, it's because you're a millionaire who is not part of the club, right? You're somebody who's not rich enough to have the system rigged in your favor, right? That if your last name is Rockefeller or Carnegie or DuPont or Rothschild or Morgan or Chase, you are not going to go to federal prison, right? You can rip off the public left and right. The Mark Rich case, that's very famous, right? The biggest case of tax fraud in all of U.S. history, where this guy who was a big donor to the Clinton campaign ripped off the U.S. government for millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, got a presidential pardon from Bill Clinton, right? So if you look at it, all the rich people who've done prison time, and it's federal prison, that's where you go for financial crimes usually, right? They all seem to be supporters of Donald Trump because Donald Trump represents that lower layer of capital that feels like the game is rigged against them. They're more what you could say, they're more what you could call, they're the lower levels of the bourgeoisie, right? They are the lower levels of the rich, and they feel like they've been robbed and ripped off. They tend to be more libertarian. They wish the government would keep its hands off because they don't have the government rigged for them. ExxonMobil, the wealthy, entrenched, powerful families, they're rich enough. They're rich enough that they can, they can afford to pay higher taxes. Remember, Warren Buffett very famously said, hey, tax me more, right? He can afford it. And they don't mind the government intervening in the economy because it'll be rigged in their favor. Right? It'll be to their benefit. They have no problem with that, right? But Donald Trump represents those lower levels of capital, right? Those swamp salesmen, as they call them. Those, Betsy DeVos. I always use Betsy DeVos as an example. Who is Betsy DeVos, right? She's the head of the Department of Education. What was she before that? She's a billionaire, I believe. But where does her money come from? Amway. Those people who sell knives and Tupperware and, it's that what do you call that, multi-level marketing scheme, that everybody hears about. It's all over the country. That's where her money came from. Yeah, she's not an oil baroness. She's not a banker. She's not part of the club in the ruling class. So the fact that Trump associates with her tells you kind of who Trump is associating with. He associates with fracking companies, right, that are in competition with the major, the big four super major oil companies. Trump represents that lower level of capital, whom the federal government is often used, the federal, prosecution, the DOJ, is often used to go after. When there are scuffles within the ruling class, the richest of the rich have the DOJ in their pocket, and the lower levels of the rich do not, right? And look at the conviction rate in federal court. Look at it, right? The conviction rate is like 95%, 97%, something like that. It's ridiculous. If you go to trial in federal court, you're wasting your time. They are going to put you away. You're going to be convicted, right? Look at this federal system, right? They talk about federal prosecutors. They prosecute people, not crimes, right? It's the federal court system is, they're coming for you. Just run. Just get out of there. Just surrender. It's pretty ruthless, right? And that there's a lot of people in the lower levels of the ruling class that have picked up on this bias, right? And so Donald Trump, as president, as somebody who's closer to those lower levels of capital that feel like they're locked out of the club, he's taken some dramatic measures to enact some prison reform, right? Federal prison reform, let some people out of jail. This idea that we lock up so many people in federal prisons in the United States, it ain't a good thing. Well, there you go. That is something that Trump did that I think is a good thing. And it's something that Obama never could have done. Just like no Democrat could have ever established diplomatic relations or formally, gone to China and met with Mao. No Democrat could have done that, right? They would have been, kicked out for being a communist. But Nixon, a Republican, also a Bonapartist, or an attempted Bonapartist, he established relations with China. So, you got to be even-headed here. I urge people to not start playing tag team here. Right? Don't stop seeing things objectively. Look at what is in the interest of working families in the United States. Don't just become a foot soldier for the liberal wing of American capital, right? Be objective here. Donald Trump's speech when he said this is an economic miracle was atrocious. When he ran it against socialism, it was atrocious. When he demonized immigrants and made out the idea that all immigrants are criminals, that was atrocious, right? What he said about Venezuela in his speech, what he said about Iran in his speech was atrocious. But what he said about federal prisons, that was good. And good for him. And, that brings me to another point, that just to show you how much the politics in the USA is very much, rigged and how cynical you really have to be. I want you to look over these facts, right? Shout out to Tim, shout out to other people who are watching. Glad to have you here. But I just want to, show you. So if you look at the foreign policy of the Obama administration and the foreign policy of the Trump administration, they're mirror opposites. Right? In a mirror, you look in the mirror, it's the same image, it's just flipped, right? Obama was extremely hostile to North Korea, right? Escalating the situation in North Korea. They came out with that movie, The Interview. I mean, it was, Obama had it in for North Korea. Meanwhile, Obama wanted to negotiate with the Islamic Republic of Iran. He made the Iran nuclear deal, right? Obama did not like Netanyahu. He's a little slightly more critical of Israel than other presidents have. So what is Donald Trump? Well, Donald Trump is going to have a meeting pretty soon, a second meeting with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. He is in the process of trying to smooth over the U.S.-North Korea relationship, right? Donald Trump hates Iran, right? He's ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, right? He hates the Iran nuclear deal. He's escalating with Iran. Trump loves Netanyahu, and he loves the Israeli government and the Likud party in Israel, right? Cuba, there's another example. Cuba, right? Donald Trump has been hostile to Cuba, has rolled back a lot of what Obama did. Obama was friendly to Cuba and was trying to open up relations, trying to, establish diplomatic relations. We have an embassy in Cuba now. If you look at it, they're mere opposites. It's not like Trump necessarily was more peace-oriented. Trump wanted peace with different countries than Obama did. And I have a feeling that's because the financial interests at stake here are different, right? The Obama administration was closer to financial interests and businesses that were hostile to North Korea and friendlier to Iran, right? Obama's administration represented one section of American capital that had one agenda, and Trump's administration represents another section of American capital that had another agenda. Right? It's not about liking peace and favoring war. There is maybe a difference about soft power versus the Pentagon, but at the end of the day, it's mere opposites. Venezuela, what Trump is doing with Venezuela right now, he's got Elliott Abrams, he's got John Bolton, he's got Mike Pompeo, these old guys, a lot of them who studied Sovietology in the 80s. They went to business school and all of that, and foreign policy school in the 80s, and they studied communism. We know all about the evils of communism. They probably could sit there and play Soviet and communist trivia with me up and down, right? They're obsessed with this, and now they're going after Venezuela. And they're probably having the time of their lives because this makes sense to them, right? Iran doesn't make so much sense. Even modern China doesn't make so much sense to them. But Venezuela, right? He's a Marxist. It's Latin America. He's got a mustache, and he's bad, and and this is, we've played this game many times, and oh my gosh, we know exactly what we're doing here, and they're having a great time. Bolton and Pompeo and Elliott Abrams, who's got a big record. That guy's convicted of covering up the Iran-Contra scandal. They're having a great time, and they're doing what they've done their whole life, and they're these older guys that are like neocon war hawks, and they're doing their thing, right? And Obama, he wasn't going to have these guys in particular do their thing. He had other guys do their thing, guys like John Kerry, who was doing the whole Iran thing. And he had another crew of people that were doing their thing. There are factions and disagreements among the ruling class. This is something we should pay attention to, but we shouldn't have any illusions, right? We shouldn't pretend this is about morality. There's good guys and bad guys among these factions, because at the end of the day, this is about particular interests. This is about strategy. So there you go. But I wanted to make that point. And if you pay attention to what's happening with Korea, it's funny. Donald Trump said in his State of the Union that socialism has ruined every nation where it's ever been tried. And then today he tweeted out that North Korea is going to become an economic powerhouse. Well, in case Donald Trump didn't realize, just in case they didn't realize, North Korea has a communist party in power, the Workers' Party of Korea. Juche is socialism. It is a planned economy. So if indeed North Korea is going to become an economic powerhouse, that is going to be socialism working. So either North Korea is not really going to become an economic powerhouse, or socialism might actually work. Maybe Trump doesn't realize that North Korea's ruling party came into power. Their ideology is rooted in Marxism, Leninism. They have 5-year plans. The state controls the economy. Maybe Trump just doesn't realize that. But if North Korea is indeed going to become an economic powerhouse, they're going to do it with socialism, right? Now, some people say, well, maybe what he meant was the USA is going to invade. Well, they ain't going to. Trust me, if the USA invades and bombs and destroys your country, it ain't going to be an economic powerhouse. Libya right now, are they an economic powerhouse? Iraq, Afghanistan, come on now. So I doubt that's what he's getting at, right? Trump is offering the ability for North Korea to be economically prosperous and trade with the West if they'll play ball and negotiate with him. But he doesn't seem to realize that that's socialism. Just like people try to deny that China is socialist. One of my pet peeves, these people that sit there and will say that the USA is a socialist country because of the post office and because of, food stamps. Oh, it's socialist, that's why we're poor. No, capitalism is great, but we're poor because we became socialist. But then you say, well, China, their socialism is doing well. No, they're capitalist. It's like China with 5-year economic plans, with a huge number of government-controlled banks and government-controlled industries, with a communist party in power, that arrests billionaires all the time. How can you say that the USA is socialist but China is capitalist? At that point, it's just religion to these people. These people who believe in capitalism, these, utopian capitalists, these free market, the people that read the Ayn Rand and the Milton Friedman, these true believers, they are nothing but true believing, non-thinking cultists, right? I mean, as far as they're concerned, their ideology, nothing to do with facts. Their beliefs are not grounded in all reality, right? You point to China to say, oh, it's because they're capitalist. Well, but yet you point to our problems here in the USA, which is a wildly free market country, the most free market of any of the industrialized countries, right? We don't even have national health care. We don't, education is completely private. Even in public universities, you have to pay for it. And most people go to private schools, private education. Even the USA, they insist, well, it must be because we're socialists, because we haven't just, adopted this crazy libertarian system. So it's a pet peeve. Right? Every stereotype that you've heard about communists is so true about them, right? Right? What's the stereotype about communists? If you point to any problem that happened in any communist country, they say, well, that's not real communism. Well, that's what these people do. You point to any problem in any capitalist country, oh, it's not real capitalism, right? Or they don't care, right? That's the stereotype about communism. Well, they don't care how many people have to die in order to achieve their utopia. These people don't care how many people have to die in order to achieve their utopia. Hey, if people starve to death on the street and die because they can't get jobs and housing, if the whole country falls into chaos, well, as long as we're moving closer toward their libertarian ideal, their utopia, their unknown ideal of capitalism, they don't care. Pinochet's Chile was an economic disaster. 20 to 30% unemployment. Children fainting in school because they didn't have food. It was an economic disaster, but they think it was just an amazing occurrence. They don't care about how people's lives are actually affected as long as their ideology is implemented, right? The most bloodthirsty, violent, scary, extremist revolutionaries you've ever seen are the believers in free market capitalism, neoliberalism, objectivism, libertarianism, Milton Friedmanism, Alan Greenspanism. That stuff is the most vile, extreme, crazy, revolutionary, counter-revolutionary, globalist, destructive ideology. Everything that you have been told about communists is 1,000 times more true about those folks. Those folks are bloodthirsty, vile revolutionaries who don't care how many countries they have to destroy. When they gutted the former USSR, after the fall of the USSR, right? They went in there and they got rid of everything, almost like 80% of the farms shut down, thousands of factories closing their doors, people lost their life savings, people lost their pensions. The heroin gangs were in there. At one point in the 1990s, half of all internet pornography was being produced in the former Soviet Union, right? Sex trafficking. What these people did to Eastern Europe, to Russia in the 1990s was an abomination. I mean, Russia at that point lost roughly 10% of its population, either left the country or died. The rate of heroin addiction went through the roof. These people are violent extremists, and they don't care. Jeffrey Sachs. These folks are everything you thought was true about communists. Everything that you learned about communists. They're violent terrorist revolutionaries. They don't care about the consequences of their actions. They just dogmatically believe in their ideology. Everything you thought was true about communists is true about these quote-unquote revolutionary capitalists to an extreme. These people are dangerous extremists. Right? And that's never acknowledged, right? They don't care about the results of their actions, right? They gutted and destroyed Eastern Europe. In the 1990s, they went after Latin America, where the point that neighborhoods in the capital of Venezuela and Caracas didn't have electricity for weeks. In Bolivia, they privatized the water, and people actually went to jail because if you collected water on your roof, that was stealing the property of Nestle and Coca-Cola and American corporations that owned the rainwater of Bolivia. These folks are crazy. I went to Ecuador when I was 12 years old, in the late 90s, went to Ecuador, and I saw what libertarian, free market, IMF capitalism was doing to a country, and it shocked me. My dad was leading a nature tour. I went along, it was, I'm going to see the Galapagos Islands. My dad was there taking people around, and it was his job. He went there and led some nature tours, and I got to see Ecuador in the middle of one of these sick neoliberal free market experiments when the IMF and the World Bank and Jeffrey Sachs and Milton Friedman turned Ecuador into one of their laboratories to carry out one of their sick social experiments, right, in trying to implement an Ayn Rand fantasy in the real world. And it was shocking to me to see the crowds of starving people that I saw outside the airport. To see, to go from tourist site, these old churches in Quito that I saw, and to just see people children, kids that were younger than me, kids of my age just begging for money on the streets, hungry, skin and bones. It was a lot for me to see at a young age, and it certainly impacted the way that I developed politically to see that. And there you go. But everything that they say about Marxists, every stereotype about Marxists is overwhelmingly true about these libertarians, right? About these free marketeers, right? It's never real capitalism. It's crony capitalism. Well, I got news for you. All capitalism is crony capitalism. When a small group of people has huge amounts of wealth and power, they then rig the government to make sure they keep their small amount of wealth, their wealth and power, right? All capitalism is crony capitalism. All their talking points are nonsense. Right? And they have destroyed so many developing countries, and they're destroying this country. Like I said, there are municipalities all over the country where they don't have roads, right? Where in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Vermont, different states, municipalities can't afford to have paved roads any longer, right? And that should be great, right? Because the government, and right, if the market really needs a road, it will create it, right? So these towns, these rural towns with no paved roads should be paradises, right? That's the right thing. The market is speaking, right? The government's getting out of our lives, right? They cut food stamps on families in the Bronx or families in Illinois or families in Kansas and Nebraska, right? Single moms trying to make it in rural areas, trying to get by. Well, that's great as far as they're concerned, right? That's good. There you go, right? This is a sick ideology that has been pushed on the world. I called the class that I gave Neoliberalism a study in evil. And it is evil. It is the definition of evil. Everything that every human society has ever associated with good, compassion, kindness, care, love for your fellow man, loyalty to your community, loyalty to your nation, loyalty to your tribe. They don't believe in any of it, right? They believe in rugged individualism. You against the world. Individuals against the world. That's what they believe. This is the definition of evil, right? There's a reason that Ayn Rand, when she was first moving to the United States, there's a reason that she admired William Hickman, a strangler, a man who strangled his wife. There's a reason for that, right? She looked up to this man who murdered his own wife, right? There's a reason for that, right? That this ideology that has been spoon-fed to the American people by, every book, Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, Friedrich von Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, all this stuff is really, really dangerous. This is the definition of evil, right? This is the definition of evil. Someone pointed out, well, that the libertarians are the hedonists of ancient Rome. No, not necessarily. The hedonists of ancient Rome, yes, they were cruel, sadistic, they were very selfish, but they at least had, on some level, there was this belief that they believed in Romans, right? They believed in Romans. They believed that their tribe, their nationality or whatever, they were loyal to Rome, right? And that they believed on some level that they had an obligation to other people within the Roman tribe, right? These libertarians don't believe in that. They don't believe in any form of collectivism, right? Radical individualism, right? That's what these people espouse. The virtue of selfishness. That's Ayn Rand's book. She actually wrote a book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. This is dangerous, dangerous stuff, right? The first time I encountered this stuff, I was shocked. I was blown away that I don't care what your religion is. Maybe you don't even have a religion. If you're just a humanist atheist who believes in basic concepts of morality, you've got to be terrified of this stuff, right? I mean, this woman said that what was done to the Native Americans was good. She said that what was done to the Palestinians was good, right? I mean, this is some vile, vile stuff. I hope that I am sounding the alarm, because neoliberalism, economic neoliberalism, is a danger. It is a big, big danger to the future of humanity. Oh boy, I don't know how I got on that kick. Didn't plan it, but it was fun. I mean, it needs to be said. But I know a lot of people are commenting. Bird World has chimed in about Ayn Rand being an Israel supporter. JT24 said neoliberalism is death by 1,000 cuts. Who else is on here? Kinky, I know she's been on here tweeting out. Good to see you, Kinky. Always a pleasure. I don't consider you to be a lurker. I consider you to be a fan. But if you want to be a lurker, you can be a lurker. It's your choice. Adam Smith would rotate in his grave if he could hear this libertarian BS, says Etatist. And that's true, right? Adam Smith believed that you needed government paid for roads. You needed a public sector, right? I mean, that was just basic. Shout out to Ramiro, who's just joined us. Ramiro Funes, good longtime friend. Shout out to Kazuya, talking about the French uprisings. A lot of us joining in. We're having a great time here on YouTube Live. It's Saturday night. I'm here in my Brooklyn apartment. I am happy. You are happy. We're all having a great, great time. What a night. What a night. Oh, boy. But, it's interesting. They actually recently had a hearing before the Armed Services Committee, and there was a Pentagon general who actually said that the reason that the USA maintains AFRICOM, which is the military presence in Africa, the U.S. military presence in Africa, he said that AFRICOM is about stopping environmental degradation, right? I think that's hilarious. I mean, does anyone in their right mind believe that the USA is maintaining a military presence on the African continent to protect the environment, right? That, we're worried about the pollution, about oil dumping in those rivers and trees, and we're worried about those little fishes and all of that. And the U.S. Army is in Africa to protect the environment, right? It's an EPA kind of thing, right? Does anyone believe that, right? So there you go, right? I mean, that shows how ridiculous and how disingenuous our leaders can really be. I was shocked when I heard that. I wanted to add, the State of the Union address, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others were wearing white. And they were wearing it to kind of honor the anniversary of women's suffrage. That, it was in 1920 that women first got their right to vote. There was a suffragist movement that started, it was long-standing. I mean, went back decades. Women had been struggling for the right to vote, and they wore white. White was the color that the women who were fighting for the right of women to vote wore. And I think that struggle, there's not enough knowledge about the struggle for women's right to vote. For example, one of the women who was very key in fighting for women's rights to vote was Carrie Nation. I don't know if you've ever heard of Carrie Nation, but she was a woman she'd started out, she was a preacher, and she would go from town to town in the United States preaching against the drinking of alcohol. But the reason that she opposed the drinking of alcohol was because she associated alcohol with domestic violence, right? That men would get drunk and beat their wives. And so she devoted her life to going around and urging people to stop drinking. And when the movement to give women the right to vote began, she was a key leader of it. Carrie Nation, just a kind of an iconic figure. And Carrie Nation, even though she was going around, she was super religious and going around urging people not to drink alcohol, even though she was, she was this religious fanatic, she was on the far left, right? And U.S. history is not, cut and dry. There was a time in U.S. history. I mean, you look at some of these figures like Anna Louise Strong, my favorite journalist, or Susan B. Anthony, right? The woman who's most publicly associated with women's suffrage rights. A lot of those far left activists, like John Brown, a lot of them were fanatical Protestants. You talk about the Second Great Awakening, this kind of movement of religious fervor in New England, where people were moving out to Ohio and settling it. Like Mormonism comes out of that. I'm actually descended from Charles G. Finney. I'm like his direct ancestor. Charles G. Finney was one of these big ministers during the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening. He was here in New York, and then he moved out to Ohio. That's where I'm from. My family's from Ohio, and on my mother's side of the family, I'm descended from this Charles G. Finney character. If you look at kind of Protestant Americans and the Second Great Awakening, there's a whole history of kind of progressive Protestants who, it was their moral obligation to oppose slavery. It was their moral obligation to demand that women get the right to vote. U.S. history is kind of complicated. It's not as cut and dry. Nowadays, to say that one's a deeply religious person is to say you're right-wing and conservative. I mean, we saw that in Trump's speech as he was pandering to the religious right and their rhetoric of abortion, but it's not that cut and dry and simple, right? Susan B. Anthony, right, who was the woman who is most publicly identified with the struggle to get women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony was deeply religious, and she also was a socialist. She very famously said to Eugene Debs, "If you give us suffrage, we will give you socialism." Right? That was Susan B. Anthony, right? It's interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is that the movement for women's liberation, around the time women got the right to vote, there was kind of a split in it. And I think that this is important to talk about. Maybe I'm mansplaining here. I don't want to get too into this. I'm sure there are women activists that can explain this kind of thing in much better detail than I can. But there was kind of a division that emerged. And that the Soviet Union, women got the right to vote in the Soviet Union before women got the right to vote in the United States. The Soviet Union in 1917, they immediately gave women the right to vote, to run for office. There were women in Soviet government. You had figures like Anastasia Kollontai and others that were just kind of key figures in Russian Marxism and Bolshevism. But at the same time, you saw a shift in the Soviet Union over the course of the 1920s. Right? That they had tried to abolish the family. They tried to abolish marriage. There was the famous glass of water quote where Bolsheviks were going around and saying that sex should be as meaningless as drinking a glass of water when you're thirsty. And that the attempts to try and impose, liberal Western leftist ideas about family life onto the Russian people had kind of disastrous consequences. A lot of these peasants were just really off-put by the Bolsheviks because of that. They really didn't appreciate the Bolsheviks coming in there and saying that you shouldn't get married or you shouldn't do that. And they opposed it. And that's why Stalin, with the rise of Stalin, you saw the rise of what you could call the Soviet family. And Trotsky denounced it, of course. He called it the Thermidor in the family. But ultimately, the Soviet Union, it gave women the right to vote. It gave women the right to work. Women worked in factories alongside men. Women were part of the Communist Party, were leading it. But it still promoted the family. They had the Soviet family of the mother and the father and the children. The mother and father both have jobs. The children, are taken care of at daycare. When the family is working, there were collective kitchens, so you didn't have a woman. The burden of cooking wasn't put on the wife, and people could just kind of pick up food on their way home from working in the factory. There was kind of a compromise, right, with Russia that had, at the time of the 1917 revolution, the Russian peasantry had probably the most conservative ideas in all of Europe about how the family structure should be. It was very, very traditional with the Russian Orthodox Church. And then you had the Bolsheviks that were, they were they were very influenced by the Western Marxist movement and Karl Kautsky and the Second International, and they had the most radical far left ideas about the family structure and all kinds of things. And you also saw Stalin outlaw abortion and outlaw homosexuality and start giving women medals if they had 10 children, make them the mother of the Soviet Union. That was an honor you got in Soviet Russia if you had more than 10 children. Right? So there was a bit of a thermidor, you could call it, or a compromise that was reached, and that the Soviet Union was very much an interesting thing, and that many people argue that if the Soviet Union had continued to have the far left policies of trying to abolish the family, trying to abolish marriage, promoting just, free sex and free love and pornography, those policies that the Bolsheviks had in the early years, the Soviet Union wouldn't have lasted, right? But Stalin, who was from Georgia, he was from a peasant village he'd grown up in. His father was a shoemaker. He understood the common people of Russia. He wasn't an elitist intellectual, and he knew kind of where the line was, what the compromise could be reached, right? He was all about women in government. He was all about women working in factories. He was all about women participating, but he also understood the family was very sacred to the Russian people, and that they didn't appreciate a kind of a leftist, bohemian attempt to, just impose their radical ideas from above. And that Stalin, that's kind of the brilliance of Stalin. If you read Stalin's writings from the period of the 1920s, where he's debating Trotsky, you can see that Trotsky didn't really understand the Russian people, and Trotsky had a level of contempt for the Russian people, right? He saw the peasantry especially. He said the peasantry is a class without a future. They aspire to become bourgeois. They're hopeless. He just had utter contempt for ordinary people in Russia, ordinary people in the surrounding countries. Whereas Stalin was from the people, and he understood the people, and he was trying to implement policies that would benefit average Russians. Socialism in one country, right? Stalin's goal wasn't to, spread communism all over the world, and didn't care how many people died in some big bloody crusade. Stalin's job was to use socialism to improve the lives of the people in one country, one union of Soviet socialist republics. And I think that's very fascinating. And that Margaret Sanger, right? And this is where it gets really interesting. So Margaret Sanger, who is she's the ideological founder of Planned Parenthood, right? Margaret Sanger, she had been a communist, a Marxist, right? She'd been one of the main funders of the industrial workers of the world. She was a wealthy woman of Irish heritage who was a Marxist and a communist, but she was in it because she believed in free love and sexuality. And she actually fled the country. Margaret Sanger fled the country because in her publication that she wrote, in her Socialist Woman publication, Revolutionary Woman, she called for the assassination of John D. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest men in the country, and was circulating this. Of course, that's illegal to call for people being killed, and so she fled the country. But then, as the Soviet Union became more conservative, and it wasn't the free love, egalitarian, libertarian paradise that she wanted, she turned against the Soviet Union and turned against Marxism. And then, even though she'd called for the assassination of John D. Rockefeller, she came back to the United States. She was all about birth control and abortion. She came back to the United States, and she actually set up a birth control clinic in Brownsville in New York. And who paid for it? John D. Rockefeller. He paid for it. And the Rockefellers were into Malthusianism. They thought that the problem wasn't capitalism. They said the problem is overpopulation. There's just too many people in the world. The working class people, there's too many of them. They're a bunch of useless eaters, a term that was later used by the Nazis. And so John D. Rockefeller funded a feminist, a former Marxist, Margaret Sanger, to start the movement to get abortion and birth control legalized in the United States during the 1920s. Very interesting history there, right? There were a lot of very radical revolutionary women like Anna Louise Strong, like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who remained Marxists, were loyal to the Soviet Union, understood there were contradictory aspects of Soviet society. But then you had folks like Margaret Sanger, who they didn't go along with it, and they turned against Bolshevism because they were in it for sex. They weren't in it for the revolutionary Marxism. They were not in it. They were not in it to free the working class and try to build an ideal communist society and a socialist future. They were in it for gender liberation. It was single issue, and they saw the Soviet Union as lacking in the field that they believed in, so then they broke with Marxism. And that's a very dramatic point, right? That Hillary Clinton and others really admire Margaret Sanger. And Margaret Sanger, in the 1920s, she spoke at Ku Klux Klan meetings. right? She spoke to the Ku Klux Klan, and you know, she made quotes where she basically argued that African Americans would, you know, that we need abortion and birth control because it'll get rid of African Americans and other races she considered to be inferior. Margaret Sanger was a pretty awful individual. She was a sellout of Marxism, right? She traded socialism for sex. She believed in free love. She stopped believing in socialism when the Soviet Union didn't turn out to be a free love and gender sexual paradise. And that shows that there's a divide in leftism. Are you for the working class? Are you fighting for the working class and for the liberation of all humanity? Or are you in it because you want to be an individual? You don't want anyone to tell you what to do. You want total freedom. And I mean, you know, this middle class current, you know, that really is represented best by Trotsky, wants something very, very different than the masses of people who do become socialists in revolutionary situations. And that division really has defined what is now leftism. And that's why it's so confusing today to talk about what is left. What does it mean to be a leftist, right? Because Margaret Sanger types are now allies of imperialism. Meanwhile, you got figures like Stalin. A lot of them are very conservative, you know. I mean, Syria, the Syrian government, Ba'athist Arab socialism. They believe in socialism and a planned economy, and you know, I mean, their economic policies are far to the left of Bernie Sanders, but they're also very socially conservative. You know, homosexuality, I believe, is illegal in Syria, right? That they, you know, their constitution talks about Islam and Sunni Islam having a special place. Bashar Assad is an Alawite. The majority of the population is Sunni, and they really push kind of, you know, this need for the government to keep everything decent. And that this is a divide, right? That right and left are not as clearly divided as they once were during the Cold War. That over the course of the Cold War, you got a division between, you know, social liberalism and middle class elements who just want total freedom, and the masses of people who want their lives to get better and want a government of action that fights on their behalf against the rich and powerful. And that this division really, you know, raises the question, what does it mean to be a leftist in 2019, right? I'm a leftist, but like, as I said, things have gotten better, but there was a time where I was really, I was not Mr. Popular in left-wing circles, right? And that was because I didn't go along with this mob mentality of drive out Trump and it's the apocalypse because Trump got elected, right? So, you know, you have to, you know, things are very confusing. You know, we live, you know, there's people talking about postmodernism, but it's like we're living almost in what you might call postmodernism. We're living in a new era of politics where everything isn't cut and dry. Being a liberal and a leftist in a lot of cases in the United States means you're more militaristic. You want more wars and militarism and aggression. So enough about that. A few other things on my mind. I wanted to talk about what's going on in Korea because I just saw that, you know, they've announced that relations between Japan and South Korea at this point are at an all-time low. And that's interesting. And it's also interesting they just recently put up monuments in South Korea to the martyrs of the White Robe movement, right? 1919 in Korea, when Japan was occupying Korea, there was the White Robe movement. It was a peaceful movement demanding that Japanese occupiers leave. They wore white robes and they marched for peace. And in response to that, the Japanese occupiers slaughtered them, and then they burned a school and killed a bunch of children who had nothing to do with the protest, just to show how angry they were at the people of Korea for protesting against their occupation. It was a horrendous incident, the White Robe incident in 1919 in Korea. And so now in Seoul, in South Korea, this new government of Moon Jae-in, this government that wants to negotiate with the North, has erected a monument, a beautiful monument, honoring the women and others who died, you know, protesting for Korean independence. And it's a dirty little secret that the allies of the United States, the military dictators Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee, Japanese collaboration, folks. You know, when Japan was occupying Korea, you know, Syngman Rhee was a Japanese collaborator, and the government that the USA, you know, backed and installed in South Korea in the aftermath of the Second World War had a lot of Japanese collaborators, bootlickers, people who had worked with Japan to colonize their own people. And that's a detail. And that was the program that the Korean Workers' Party took power on. If you read, there's actually a beautiful speech that Kim Il-sung gave over the radio to announce the formation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And if you read it, it's very interesting because Kim Il-sung lays out what their program was. He created a national health care service. He wanted to give the right to vote to all Korean men and women. And he called for seizing and nationalizing the property of all Japanese collaborators. It was a very moderate program. And people don't know this, but the Korean Workers' Party was a merger. It was a merger of the Korean Communist Party and the Korean Social Democratic Party. and the Korean Christian Party. And they were the three parties that had been resisting and actively fighting the Japanese during the Second World War. And in the northern parts that were liberated by Soviet troops, they merged together to form the Korean Workers' Party. The Korean Workers' Party is not just the Communist Party. It was a merger of all the anti-Japanese parties in the north. In the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. Anna Louise Strong visited North Korea shortly after it was formed, and she wrote a very, very good piece about it, a very good pamphlet you can read about what was happening in North Korea at the time, before the Korean War ultimately broke out. And the reason the Korean War broke out, people say, well, the North invaded the South. Well, how do you invade? Korea is one country, right? So the North invaded the South. It's not an invasion if it's your own country. But the reason that there was, efforts by the North, military efforts against the U.S.-installed government, the military dictatorship of Syngman Rhee, the reason for that was Syngman Rhee was actively killing communists, right? Whole villages and Jeju Island and other parts of South Korea that were pro-communist and Marxist and organized into trade unions and such were being slaughtered. Syngman Rhee was murdering and massacring people in big numbers, just slaughtering people. And in response, the people in northern Korea, the North Korean forces, they felt an obligation to help their country folk in another part of their country. Korea is one country. And let me say that again. Korea is one country. Korea is one country. Korea is one country. Korea is one country. It has two governments at this point. There are two governments on the Korean Peninsula. There is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, and there is the Republic of Korea in the south. And for most of South Korea or the Republic of Korea's existence, it hasn't been democratic. It has been an absolute military dictatorship. Park Chung-hee, before that Syngman Rhee, and there have been many uprisings among the people. There was the April Revolution, where the students overthrew the government in the 60s or late 50s, I believe. There was student uprisings in the 80s. There's a long history of the people of South Korea fighting to just have elections. Just to have elections. And the U.S. military is in there, and they have backed up some brutal. Read about what Park Chung-hee did. All the stuff we hear about North Korea that's not confirmed. We don't know if it's true or not. It's unsubstantiated. But all the stuff we hear about them, read some of what Syngman Rhee, the military dictator, the United States, was really supportive of. Read what he did and how he had concentration camps for orphan children where they were worked to death. Right? Syngman Rhee was not a nice guy, right? Real atrocious crimes. He arranged for the standard of living in the urban areas of South Korea to go up, right? And that was, and worked with the Kennedy administration to create the steel industry and to take some moves that would advance the standard of living of certain people in the country. But at the same time, he was vicious. Syngman Rhee, there's a lot of people who died, a lot of good people who did nothing wrong, orphan children, people were, rounded up and put in prison camps and worked to death just for being homeless. It was pretty vicious what Syngman Rhee did, and no one talks about that, right? South Korea, they always say it's democratic. Well, in the 80s, they started having free elections, and read about the national security laws that they have in South Korea, right? If you so much as say that you're a socialist or a communist in South Korea, you go to jail, right? There was a young man who I believe got a prison sentence for retweeting, ironically, with sarcastic comments, retweeting with sarcastic comments and irony, the tweets of leaders of the North, right? It is a very, very authoritarian society. A lot of massacres of striking workers. Everything in North and South Korea isn't cut and dry. And you'll notice that when that North Korean team came to the Olympics, everything we hear in the USA, everything we hear is, these people are, the people in the South are terrified of the North. They hate North Korea. It's a national embarrassment. They love the United States for having its military in there. What happened at the Olympics, right? When that North Korean team came in there, all these thousands and thousands of people in the Olympic Stadium burst into applause, just cheered in huge numbers for the North Korean team. Right? On national television, they cheered for their northern country folk. Right? So everything you thought you knew is wrong, Read about the Unified Progressive Party in South Korea that was, rounded up and disbanded, right? Totally undemocratic, the way they were dealt with. Read what even like Human Rights Watch and other kind of very mainstream, think tanks had to say about their national security laws, right? But, we've got Moon Jae-in. He's angry with Japan. He's putting up monuments to people the Japanese slaughtered. He's trying to negotiate with the North. You got Trump, who's excited about an upcoming meeting in Vietnam with Kim Jong-un, is saying that North Korea is going to be an economic powerhouse, even though he says socialism could never make a country good. So I don't know how it's going to work, right? But there you go. There you go, folks. I mean, you know, the Korean situation, I'm glad to see that we're moving closer to peace, right? And I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be dishonest here. I'm not going to gloss over. Life in North Korea is difficult, right? North Korea's government is very authoritarian. It is a military society, but that's the conditions and the situation that they are in, right? I don't think the people of North Korea think that the way they are at this very moment is an ideal state of being. But it's been imposed on them by blockades and years of war. In the 1990s, they couldn't get, food. They couldn't get petroleum to grow their own food, and there was a food crisis, and lots of people died. And that North Korea, yes, is a very rigid, authoritarian society, nowhere near the level of human rights and civil liberties and freedom that we have in the Western countries. And I'm not going to be facetious, and I'm not going to pretend that life in North Korea is some kind of paradise. I'm being honest with you, right? I'm being straight up. That yes, North Korea is fighting for its life. It is locked down and loaded. It is a military society that is very rigid and very authoritarian, but that was imposed on them. That was imposed on them by the West, by sanctions, by a huge, layer of U.S. troops who rehearse for all-out war against them with their drills every year, and under the circumstances that North Korea is in, they've had to become a very rigid and tight and authoritarian society. And that's a fact, okay? And people point at me and say, you're an apologist. No, I'm not an apologist. I'm a realist, right? If any society was under that layer of threat, where they couldn't get petroleum in the 1990s and people were starving to death. They couldn't grow food in their country. There was military barricades in there. I mean, the level of pressure that they were under, any society would become locked down and rigid. And frankly, the fact that the North Korean government made it through the 1990s, the arduous March period that they call it, shows how much support the Korean Workers' Party really has, right? Any other government would collapse under those circumstances. But the Korean Workers' Party during the 70s and 80s did so much to raise the living standards in North Korea, right? I mean, they wiped out illiteracy, they created universal housing, the standard of living vastly improved, the life expectancy almost doubled. What they did prior to the 1990s, prior to the disaster of the arduous march, was so dramatic that they were able to get through a really horrendous period during the 1990s because they have a huge layer of support. Don't think for a minute that the people of North Korea don't support Kim Jong-un, don't support his father Kim Jong-il or Kim Il-sung. They absolutely do. They absolutely do, right? That Korean party has led them through some really tough times. You can criticize their decisions. I'm not here to defend their decisions, their policies. I don't know what I would do if I were running a country under similar circumstances. That's not even for me to say. But I'm telling you, folks, that the Korean Workers' Party has a huge layer of support, number one, and that the conditions in North Korea, the fact that they're as authoritarian as they are, that was imposed on them. And that they would like to be a looser society. They would like to loosen up, but under the circumstances, they would like to be doing business with the rest of the world and trading. That there's two sides to every story, and I think folks ought to remember that. I'm not a blind apologist of North Korean, and I'm not Korean, right? I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say I advocate the Juche ideology because I'm not from Korea, right? Juche ideology is socialism and Marxism applied to the Korean Peninsula. I am not on the Korean Peninsula. I am not from the Korean culture. I don't speak Korean. I don't really know much about Korean traditional culture. So it's not for me to embrace that ideology, right? I'm just telling you that I know for a fact that North Korea is a society that has been under the gun, that has been locked down. They have faced huge military threat. They have faced huge amounts of economic sabotage and terrorism from the West. And they would like to move toward a society that is more open, and they haven't had that ability because of what the imperialists have done. But anyhow, and I see someone saying U.S.-South Korea drills could turn on a dime. No, and that's true, right? We don't know, right? This could just be a maneuver to try and weaken North Korea. It's not a done deal. I'm happy that things are moving in a good direction. I'm happy to see Moon Jae-in and Trump also, moving closer to a deal with North Korea. But, you don't know what could happen. And, I mean, when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to Iran, the Trump administration is just completely off. And I mean, my goodness, that speech when he was talking about all, I mean, how many, immigrants to the United States commit crimes at a much lower rate than citizens do, right? Immigrants don't want to get deported. They're very, very careful to follow the law. MS-13 is not a good organization. It's very vicious and rotten. But if you tighten the restriction on immigrants, they're going to get stronger, right? Immigrant communities are going to be afraid to call the police, afraid to cooperate with law enforcement. That people who come into the country are going to be more carefully smuggled in, right? That cracking down on immigrants is MS-13's bread and butter. So when Trump, holds up MS-13 like, aha, look how scary they are, that means you got to follow my policies. No. Groups like MS-13 are the result of the kind of policies that Trump is putting in terms of immigration. So that needs to be said. But listen, folks, it's been a great night. I'm so glad you've all been part of this. I'm having a great time, and I love you all. And let me end by saying that. I love you all. You all are great folks, right? The fact that you're part of these lives, the fact that you're engaging here and asking tough questions and speaking your mind, all my fans, all my haters, all my lurkers, everybody, I love you all, right? You all are good folks. I deeply care about you. We are doing something that's very, very unique here. Thank you, Dante. We're doing something that's very, very unique here. We're talking about socialism and economics and current events and world events in a way that you don't get, right? The mainstream left doesn't talk like me. You certainly don't hear people talking the way I talk on the right. I'm offering you all something that's very, very special, and you all want to hear it, and you're eating it up, and you're loving it, and I thank you. I love you all, right? If you haven't had a chance to watch my talk on ancient Rome, check it out. I just posted a video this afternoon about Ben Shapiro and some of his distortions. Check that out. I love you all. You're good folks, right? And, we live in some very, very strange times right now. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I do know that the working families of this country, like I said before, have had it up to here. The Trump is dead wrong when he talks about an economic miracle. Too many working families are suffering, right? This is an economic crisis that we're living in. We're living in capitalism in a crisis due to the rise of the computer revolution and such. And it's time for working families. It's time that we had a government of action to fight for working families. It's time to have a government of action. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action, shout out to Sharon Pitts, to fight for working families. Thank you, Christopher Asher. And we need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. I can't say it enough times. We absolutely need a government of action to fight for working families, because that's the only way we're going to get out of this crisis. So thank you all. I love you all. John Denny, Presente, he was a good friend of mine, someone I'll never forget. My best wishes to all of you. Stay strong.